Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Welcome to all of you. Now, in today's session, we will be studying on load dispatch centers. We will understand what are the powers, functions given. We will also trace the growth of the load dispatch center, how it has evolved over a period of time. What is the legal provisions which are given under the Act for the functioning of the load dispatch centers. We will also read some of the case laws to understand that how the role has been interpreted, how the role has been understood whenever the dispute has come before the tribunal or the court, as the case may be. Now, these are the concepts which we will be covering. As I said to you, we will be discussing about the powers and functions given. We will trace the history, how it has evolved over a period of time, what are the challenges in times to come, and then obviously judicial approach will be one of the significant point of discussion to understand the nuances of this. Now, when you look at the load dispatch center, it has its origin prior to 2003 Act. Load dispatch center was conceptualized under the 1948 Act, the Electricity Supply Act, and it was done through an amendment in the year 1991. But then the idea of having integrated system for load transmission for transmission of electricity from one area to another area was very well visualized in the year 1964, when the regional grids came into existence. And these grids were governed by regional electricity boards, and then in 1970 the regional grids which were governed under the electricity boards rechristened as regional load dispatch center, and obviously in 1998 this regional load dispatch center has become an apex body which has been given the responsibility for a smooth functioning of the transmission sector, and also to ensure that there is efficient operation of grid. Now, let us try to understand that why the very need of development of grid network was thought of, or why it was being planned. Now, when you look at the availability of the fuel to generate electricity, it is very asymmetrical in this country. The northern part you would find is more on hydro, eastern part is more on coal based thermal power plant. So, this very differences on the availability of fuel led to very sort of unequitable growth of the power sector. It did not grow in a very uniform manner across the country, but at the same time the need of electricity is very uniform, regardless of whether that region is generating electricity or not. So, even if eastern region generates surplus, that surplus cannot be consumed by this region, and thus this surplus has to be transported to the other parts of the country, and this is possible only when we have a very robust grid mechanism, where the evacuation is being planned, where scheduling is in plan, that what quantity is being injected in the grid and what is the demand from the consumer side. So, all this led to the growth of load dispatch center, because there was a need felt to have a very coordinated planning. Coordinated planning not confined to only one region, coordinated planning not only to the region where the electricity is getting generated, because power sector gives a lot of promise to the economic growth, and in order to ensure economic growth, in order to ensure that there is an adequate return on the investment done by the investor, it is desirable to have a very quality supply of electricity. So, you can very well visualize that western part is more industrialized in terms of manufacturing units and all, eastern part having thermal power stations. So, there is a need to connect these regions for the quality supply of the electricity and also for the development of the power market as such. Now, when the load dispatch center, the idea was conceived, that time it was thought that let the central transmission utility or the state transmission utility carries on the activity of the load dispatch center, because they are anyway not engaged in the generating business or they are not engaged in the trading and all. So, under 2003 Act it was provided that this transmission utilities both at the central level and the state level, they shall be functioning as load dispatch centers until a government company or an authority is been constituted by the central government or by the state government. So, under 2003 Act it was clearly provided that there is a need to have an independent autonomous body which shall look into the activities related to load dispatch center. Now, this load dispatch activities, it, as I said, initially was being looked after by the transmission utilities. Then there is a government company which was constituted for taking care of transmission network, transmission utility, power grid. Power grid was carrying on the activities of the load dispatch center, and then finally from power grid another company was being established having kind of parental control over that company by the power grid, that is Power System Operation Corporation Limited, POSOCO. Now, POSOCO has now been given an independent status. It has the equity share has been transferred from power grid to the president, and now it has completely been given a distinct legal identity and independent from power grid. Now, when you look at the growth, the development, as I said that because of the demand across the country, demand of electricity across the country, a need was felt to interconnect the whole country, so that generation in one region can cater the demand in another region, and that is possible only when these grids are interconnected. The very idea to interconnect the grid started in 1991 when eastern grid got connected with the northeastern grid, and then in 2003 the western grid got connected with the eastern grid, and then 2006 the four grids they got interconnected, and finally in 2013 southern grid got connected with rest of the grids, and therefore the very idea of one nation, one grid was achieved. Now, this one nation, one grid also important for mitigating any situation where power failure takes place of extreme magnitude. In fact, the outage which happened in 2012 accelerated the need of one nation, one grid. So, because now the grids are connected, the availability of electricity from one region to another region is very much possible, it is very much planned, and this also, this very provisioning of connecting the grid across the country also sends a very strong message to all the investors, whether they are investing in power market or they are investing in other infrastructural project, that this very interconnection can ensure sustainable quality supply of electricity, and that is why one nation, one grid becomes a very significant point. Now, initially the load dispatch center was conceived as a center to look into the generating capacity and then planning the scheduling accordingly. So, it was more of a kind of management role, but then the nature of the role has been changed now. The reason being the private participation in the transmission sector, because earlier what was assigned to the transmission utility is now been given to an independent body, and for very obvious reason, that if the transmission utility has a vested interest in getting the business, obviously that utility would not be deciding on a very fair terms. Possibly it would be wrong to say that always that would be the case, but then because the transmission sector is also opened up for private participation, then there would be a possible conflict between the utilities which are already operating under the control of the government and then private player. Then it is the responsibility of the load dispatch center to treat the players in a very fair manner. Apart from that, the very provisioning of open access, as we have said that under 2003 Act, one of the remarkable changes brought in was to introduce open access to increase the competition in the power market. Now, with this provision of open access, it is important that the players which are involved in transmission, players who are involved in distribution, they need to be treated in reasonable and fair manner, and this is what the load dispatch center would ensure. And then load dispatch center will also ensure a subtle distinction between transmission operator and system operator, because earlier when the utility was handling this task, they were into transmission as well as they are into system of operation. They were channelizing the transport of electricity from generating unit to the distribution licenses or the licenses, and then they were also into the operational issues. Now, with the transmission utility been asked to be competitive, there will be a conflict of interest, and that is why it is suggested that let there be a distinct entity to regulate the scheduling of the electricity, and thus the significance of the growth of load dispatch center. Because load dispatch center, they are into real time operations. What is the injection happening to the grid, which all licenses have placed the demand, whether someone is doing an overdrawal, what shall be the monitoring for drawal of electricity, monitoring the flow of electricity across the network, and then maintaining reliability, because there where the power to pass necessary directions becomes important. That if any player in the market deviates from the standard norm, the load dispatch center is required to step in and ensure that the player is playing as per the agreed rule of the game, and if not, penalty is to be imposed. So, under 2003 Act, the legacy was continued. The central government has given the legal status to that division of the country into 5 different zones. So, country was divided into 5 different zones: eastern, northeastern, western, northern and southern zone, and these 5 regions were being given a separate load dispatch center known as regional load dispatch center. So, under section 25 of the Act, this regional division was being done to ensure that the electricity gets supplied in a very efficient way, in a very economic way, and also in a very integrated manner, and to both licensees and the consumer. So, load dispatch center has a role also towards the consumer, not only towards the licensees alone, and 3 layered structures were being planned: NLDC at the top, RLDC at the mid level and SLDC at the bottom. National load dispatch center, regional load dispatch center and state load dispatch center. The responsibility to establish national load dispatch center and regional load dispatch center lies with the central government, whereas for state load dispatch center the responsibility lies with the state government, and reasons are very obvious, because electricity as a subject falls in the concurrent list, and therefore, there has to be a shared responsibility as per the understanding of the constitution, which we have discussed in module 1. Now, what are the functions which are given to the load dispatch centers? 28 and 32 deals with regional load dispatch centers and state load dispatch center respectively. Functions are very similar given to them. Regional load dispatch centers, they are considered as an apex body to ensure integrated operation. It is not NLDC, it is regional load dispatch center, because there is a need to have a stakeholder also from the states. So, very centralized institution may not serve the purpose which is being thought of, and that is the reason why RLDC, and that is prior to 2003, as I have said, that has happened in way back in 1998. So, 2003 Act continued that structuring. The RLDC has a responsibility to maintain the grid code, follow the grid code. Grid code is something which is to be given by the appropriate commission. Obviously, electricity authority plays a role to advise on the technical specifications. Then load dispatch center has a responsibility for optimal scheduling and dispatch of electricity, that what is to be injected, as I said, what is to be assigned. And then most important one is that overall supervisory role lies with load dispatch center. In case of interstate transmission system, it is of RLDC. In case of intrastate, it is for SLDC. Now, RLDC is also given necessary power to give directions and exercise supervision and control. This includes even giving the necessary power to the state load dispatch centers. RLDC can give necessary direction even to SLDCs, because at the end of the day, the coordination is needed throughout the country. It is not only in one pocket or another pocket, and that is why RLDC has been rightly assigned this task. Because if this task is not been assigned to any institution, there will be an issue with the stability in grid. Licensee may draw more powers than what that licensee is authorized for, and thus cause instability. And we know very well that electricity is one product which cannot be stored, and therefore, the management becomes very scientific, very methodological, and RLDC can also issue necessary directions to licensee and generating units, and they are bound to comply with those directions which RLDC would give. If RLDC gives a direction and if the licensees or generating units or the SLDCs fail to comply, RLDC can impose fine. Obviously, you can imagine that if some such power is been given under the law upon any authority, there may be chances of dispute, and for that appropriate commission has been given authority to adjudicate the dispute. So, appropriate commission generally appoints an adjudicating officer to look into the allegation made and decides accordingly, and the penalty which has been suggested in the law is that for RLDC, the penalty RLDC can give up to 15 lakhs, and for SLDCs up to 5 lakhs rupees. In order to maintain fairness, to eliminate biasness, it has been suggested that the load dispatch center shall not be involved into trading activities, so that they should not have any interest at all. Now, the question comes in that how do you ensure that they would act independently, they would not act under any influence? One factor which has always been looked at is of autonomy, financial autonomy, because functional autonomy perhaps can be ensured by laying down a very well knitted structure under the law. But what about the financial autonomy? If they are dependent upon the government for all kind of financial requirement, then there is a possibility that they may not act independently, because government is also into power market, government is owning the generating units, government is owning the transmission utility, and therefore, it has been suggested that for financial autonomy, let there be fees and charges which will be levied as suggested by the appropriate commission, and those fees and charges will help the load dispatch centers to get the status of autonomous institution, and perhaps the things are moving in that direction. Now, when you look at the role of the load dispatch center plays a very critical role. It is a critical load in a sense that it, on the one hand, deals with statutory bodies like commissions, appropriate commissions, regulatory commissions, the government bodies like CA and all. On the other hand, it engages with generating units, it engages with transmission licensees, it engages with distribution licensee, it engages with end consumer. So, load dispatch centers, they are playing a very vital role of hand holding between the policy makers, the statutory bodies and the real players in the market, generating units, transmission licenses and distribution licenses. And therefore, it is advisable that the load dispatch center conduct its affair in such a manner so that a message should go to all that the rules are being framed in a, rules are being followed in a very fair way. As I said, interstate transmission is with RLDC, intrastate transmission is the responsibility again with the SLDC. State government needs to provide for this. It says that it is the responsibility of the state commission to promote transmission, wheeling and interconnection within a territorial jurisdiction, and it is the responsibility of commission to see that how intra-state transmission network works. The law also says that if a transmission facility is having some surplus capacity, then appropriate commission can very well intervene and ask that surplus facilities to be used. Obviously, it will be an use only for intervening period, and for that there will be a separate charges to be levied and which has to be decided by the appropriate commission. So, idea is what is given under section 35, the idea is that let the generated electricity not to be allowed to go wasted. Let us ensure that the infrastructure is optimally used. Now, 37 becomes very important, because 37 is on the line of section 11 of the act which we have discussed, where the appropriate government is allowed to give necessary directions to RLDC or SLDC. Now, but the point of departure from section 11 is, under section 11 you would find that it says that such instructions are to be given by the appropriate government only when there is extraordinary circumstances, and section 11 works in relation to generating units. But under section 37 it is for RLDCs, it does not talk about any extraordinary circumstance, but it says that the directions can be issued only for a smooth and stable transmission and supply of electricity. But you can very well visualize that in general, under the 2003 Act, state government or the central government has not been given any direct role to regulate the power market. So, wherever such power is given, it has to be exercised in a very circumscribed way. Government needs to be extremely cautious before asserting the power under section 37, so that it should not defeat the liberalization regime which has been achieved, which is being planned under 2003 Act. So, only to cater the political interest, section 13 should not be employed. These are the challenges which are there for the load dispatch centers. One challenge is the way energy mix is happening in this country. Considerable quantity of electricity is being injected into grid through renewables, and therefore planning needs to be made accordingly. Because from the conventional sources, the gestation period is generally quite high, and therefore considerable time is available to make the planning for transmission and for the grid operation. But for renewables, because gestation period is not very high, electricity is available without much lapse of time, and therefore accordingly the grid needs to be prepared and planned. So, that is the challenge. The challenge is prosumer, wherein a new category of entity or individual is now acknowledged in the power market, that is the consumer who is playing the role of producer also. For example, someone who is setting up a solar power plant, he is consuming electricity from the grid as well as he is producing electricity for his own consumption. Then the challenge is from energy storage, because there is scientific development going on for storing electricity. With the more generating capacity, there is a possibility of exporting electricity, and therefore the plan to connect grid with the neighboring countries, and that brings in more challenges on the board. And then the drive of promoting electric vehicles in the country. More electric vehicles, obviously more stations required for charging them, and that certainly has impact on the grid operation. So, these are important challenges which are there before this. Now, let me discuss few cases with you. This one is related to transmission, Maharashtra State Electricity Power Trading Corporation versus CERC. What happened in this case is that the appellant was fully owned by state electricity boards holding company, and then this was engaged into trading. The question was raised that should it be allowed to continue in trading because it was also into transmission business. The court lifted the corporate veil to understand that who owns the appellant company, and then it has found that it is the company which is into transmission business, and therefore this company should not be allowed to be into trading business. This is another case which relates with right of way what we have discussed in the last session, where there was an objection to construct the transmission tower by the appellant here, Vijay Ramchandra. He said that no consent was taken from me for constructing the tower. The court read the relevant section, section 10 of the Telegraph Act and section 164 of Electricity Act, and said that what is needed is to pay the compensation, but then the law does not say that if the consent is not been obtained, the transmission tower is not to be erected. You can very well with these cases understand that how much importance has been given to ensure the smooth growth of electricity sector. This is a case again to SLDC. This is an interesting case. This is Delhi Transco versus CERC. What happened in this case is that Delhi Transco, being SLDC, was being warned by RLDC for overdrawal, that some licenses are overdrawing the electricity, which is making the whole overdrawal below 49 hertz, and generally for maintaining the proper scheduling it has to be 50 and above. Now, the RLDC gave warning to SLDC more than once. SLDC did not take any tangible action, it did not take any concrete action. What it did is that it simply issued an advisory to the licensees that see, you are doing overdrawal, and because of that grid is becoming unstable. When RLDC approached the Regulatory Commission to take punitive action against SLDC, Regulatory Commission constituted an appointed an adjudicatory officer, who after looking at the response imposed fine, which was to the tune of 2.5 lakhs. This was challenged by the appellant. Appellant said that we did whatever we are supposed to do it under the law. We have issued advisories to the licensees. Beyond that, we can't do anything, because appellant argued that they cannot simply switch off the supply, because that would have resulted into blackout of large area, and therefore this is what they can do maximum of issuing the advisory. Now, in this case, the SLDC also argued that when you look at the language of section 29(2), which talks about the responsibility of SLDC and the power of the RLDC to give directions, it says that direction can be given to any person. SLDC said that we are not any person, we do not fall under that definition of any person, and we are neither generating company, nor we are into transmission license, transmission business, or nor we are distribution licensee, and therefore RLDC does not have a jurisdiction to issue such directions. Now, the court in this case looked into the definition of power system, which is given under section 2 subsection 15, and said that the definition is so broad, it very well covers load dispatch centers, and load dispatch centers have a juristic status, has got a legal validity, legal status under the law, and therefore it very well satisfies the criteria of being any person for the purpose of 29(2). And moving further, the court has also said that mere issuing advisory was not enough. The SLDCs was having all authority to disconnect the line, so that the grid should not have faced the instability, and thus SLDC failed to fulfill the responsibility which was given under section 32, and thus the imposition of fine was very much as per the law. Another case wherein Messrs Meenakshi and Simhapuri Energy Power Limited, they were having generating units, they were having power plants in the same locality, they were sharing the boundary, and therefore they approached the appropriate commission that they should be allowed to develop the common transmission line. Appropriate commission allowed the same, and when they have approached the load dispatch center for considering them as a separate entity for the purpose of accounting, for the purpose of scheduling, then load dispatch center refused to consider them as separate entity. Load dispatch center said that we do not have that metering facility at our end, and therefore they needs to be considered as one single entity. In this case, the question was also raised that can two generating units develop one dedicated transmission line. The court looked into the necessary provisions of section 10 of the act and said that nowhere it has been prohibited, nowhere it has been said that two generating units cannot have one dedicated transmission line. So, the court has said that that is very much permissible under the law. On the issue of not considering them as two separate entities for the accounting purpose, for the scheduling purpose, the court said that it was wrong on the part of the load dispatch center to not to adhere to that. The tribunal said that they do have enough power under the law to make such arrangements, and because they are being governed under the act, they cannot take the shelter of the metering regulations to not to fulfill their legal duties, not to fulfill their obligation, which is clearly spelled out under either section 29 or section 32 of the act, and therefore, in this case the court has said that RLDC was wrong in not allowing these two entities to be considered as two separate entities for the purpose of metering. Now, this is another case wherein this is another interesting case wherein what happened is that this Messrs Indorama Synthetics Limited, it has injected certain quantity of electricity in grid, and it injected the electricity in the grid without informing to the load dispatch center, and then later on it has asked for the compensation. It said that I should be paid compensation because my electricity whatever I have injected was consumed. So, the load dispatch center looked into it, and then appropriate commission said that okay, because the injection has happened, it has suggested the compensation on the basis of very low variable cost. agreed by the decision, Indorama Synthetic said that ours was electricity based on costly fuel, it was a captive power plant, and therefore it deserves higher compensation than what was decided by the regulatory commission. Now, matter came before the tribunal. Tribunal looked into the legal provisions related to the responsibility of the load dispatch center, that whether load dispatch center has a responsibility to flag that see there is injection of electricity happening which should not have happened. So, looking into the legal provision, it said that it is very difficult to find out for the load dispatch center if generating unit is injecting electricity in grid without informing, because scheduling of electricity happens in advance and every planning happens on that basis, and therefore it is not very it is not possible for the load dispatch center to keep the track of injection of electricity, and in this case Indorama Synthetic company did not inform anything to the load dispatch center with regard to injection, and therefore it was said that SLDC cannot be held responsible to not to inform the appellant about the injection, because it was not brought to the notice of SLDC, and SLDC does not have a mechanism to find out the injection of electricity, the supply of supply of electricity from generating units to the grid. Moreover, the tribunal also observed that there is no legal provision in the law which allows the compensation to be paid in such situation, and therefore whatever is been paid is fine. There is no question of entertaining the appeal of the appellant in this case. So, this is all about load dispatch center, this is all about what the legal provisions are there and how it ensures independence of the load dispatch center. Thank you very much. These are the references for this module.